Depression is on the rise and there's no question about it. The number of cases recorded has significantly increased between 1990 and 2017 in all major demographics, and this number increased a further 25% during the COVID-19 pandemic. The US alone now sees 18.4% of its population undergo the disease during their lifetime, a figure which is also expected to rise in the next decade. In order to meet the diagnostic criteria for depression, a patient must have 5 or more of the following symptoms present for at least 2 weeks in seeing the person's character initially change: depressed mood for majority of the days, diminished interest and pleasure in activities, weight fluctuation, insomnia, psychomotor agitation, fatigue, feeling worthless, poor concentration, and thoughts of death or suicide. But with diagnosing depression arises a gargantuan problem. We still can't really treat it. Yes, we have medication, including SSRIs commonly prescribed in a bid to fix broken neurochemistry of those suffering, but many studies have reported that they work no differently to placebos, and even then, many patients get no alleviation at all. So something about depression must still be a mystery, right? Turns out that yes, this is the case, for in reality we still don't really know what actually causes it. So let's go over some of our best theories in the hope we can eventually learn to eradicate depression forever.
Depression is an emotion as old as mankind. Perhaps this is a reason why we sometimes fail to look at it as a disease, which it often is.
The first accounts of depression were actually recorded over 2,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia. In the descriptions though, it was actually seen as more of a spiritual condition rather than a physical one like it is today. Therefore, patients were tended to by priests instead of physicians, believing that a demon was a result of the depression developing. This belief of causation continued for 1,000 years until Hippocrates, the famous Greek physician, finally changed the way in which we see the illness. Hippocrates believed that instead of demonic possession, depression was caused through biology, yet he was still wrong. For Hippocrates insisted that depression, known as melancholia at the time, like most illnesses, was a result of an imbalance of the 4 humours. These are yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. Depression was specifically too much black bile within the spleen, but even when Hippocrates had stated this, the belief in demonic possession as a cause for depression and melancholia lasted for a further hundreds of years. Only in around 900 AD did we see Rhazes, a Persian doctor, finally classify mental illness in the brain, but even then, most people still believed depression was a result of these demons. Throughout the Middle Ages, especially with Christianity, most people thought that those with depression had been possessed by the devil or witches, and were sent to the first insane asylums, some of the most barbaric places people have ever been forced to live. However, finally in 1621, Robert Burton published the book The Anatomy of Melancholy, outlining social and psychological causes of depression with novel treatment plans. This took off, and during the Age of Enlightenment, depression was finally believed to be the result of a weakness in temperament that was inherited and could not be changed. This progressed further through the likes of Sigmund Freud, who believed depression was a response to loss, either real or symbolic, and their unconscious anger leads to self-destructive behaviour. Now, Freud was somewhat on the right track, but it left a lot to be desired. Biological models soon arose in the 70s, suggesting all mental illnesses are caused by physiological factors, with depression being the result of a lack of the neurotransmitter serotonin in the brain, hence why our medications involve rectifying this imbalance.
Depressions, which will have to be recognized and treated like other clinical syndromes, for instance, shock or congestive heart failure.
But again, not all of these medications work, so are our new theories wrong? Let's look at the evidence. Nowadays, almost all scientists believe that depression has genetic elements, and with good reasoning to think so. Using technology, we now have genome-wide association studies, which were performed to basically try and map which of our genes are linked to pretty much anything. 44 genes, specifically when they're mutated, were found as potential candidates for depression. Some of the genes linked include RBFOX1, which is linked to overactivation of the fight-flight systems, the DRD2 gene, which codes for the neurotransmitter systems for dopamine, or the TCF4 gene, which codes for brain development in its normal form. However, one gene seemed to produce much more of a stronger link than any other. It's called 5-HTT, and this gene transports serotonin and moderates the stress response. But just like any other gene, it can become mutated in offspring, or just randomly. When it's mutated, this gene becomes 5-HTT-LPR, and it's believed it can't transport serotonin as well in the brain. And in 2003, this is exactly what Capsi et al. Found. They investigated over 1,000 children and split them into 3 groups based on if they had this gene or not. Now, the team found that this hypothesis was in fact true. Those with the 5-HTT-LPR variant were much more likely to have these depressive symptoms and tendencies. But interestingly, they only really develop depression following stressful life events. In theory, you can have this gene variant, but if you don't undergo any difficulties in life, the chances of you developing depression are very slim. This was also true in the converse. Not having the gene but having the difficulties made depression also much less common. So yes, genetics does seem to play a big factor in developing depression. Another study from Pessoas in 2005 saw patients with this 5-HTT-LPR variant have their brains measured using voxel-based morphometry. Those with this variant had reduced brain matter in both the amygdala and perigenual cingulate, showing that the gene variant does indeed impact the brain. But as was the same with Capsi, this was only ever recurring when the participants had undergone some major stressor in their life. Even adoption studies following children in new homes found that even if their biological parents had the mutations coding for depression, it would only be expressed following stressors, or most of the time in these new homes, not at all. This research basically showed that depression is not just a genetic disorder, but your environment plays a huge role into the development of the disease, just as Freud said. But if this is completely true, then why would serotonin-based medication, accompanied with therapy for the stressor, be unsuccessful in treating around half of patients? Just maybe there are other theories out there, with even more explanation power than this one. So we have this clear link that genetics can produce depression when combined with one's environment. But what if someone is predisposed to this without even needing the genes? Your brain may in fact be ready to become depressed, this time with only the stressor needed. This stressor can be of any level though, which is even more terrifying. Now stay with me because this is about to get pretty intense. You see, when you're stressed, your brain, specifically the paraventricular nucleus, secretes glucocorticoids and corticotropin release factor. Upon this being present in the blood, adrenocorticotropin is released by the pituitary gland, which in turn causes cortisol to be released from the adrenal gland further down in the body. Now, cortisol is responsible for increasing blood sugar and aids the metabolism of fats, proteins and carbs. But with constant stress, as seen in depression, the body ends up with far too much cortisol in it, and this is what the problem is. With too much cortisol, we see these symptoms present themselves in depressed patients, such as the weight fluctuations. But what we can also see, as discovered again in neuroimaging techniques, is that this increase in cortisol noticeably causes the hippocampus to fail at preventing the paraventricular nucleus to switch off the circuit, meaning that once stress begins in the body, cortisol is going to be constantly released. The patient is going to always be undergoing these effects. Yet something else happens that's actually even worse. When adrenocorticotropin is released into the blood, a huge amount of pro-inflammatory cytokines is released also. These basically induce inflammation in the body. They'll further interfere with the amount of serotonin a depressed patient will receive, inducing further sadness. But as well, as found by Hart in 1988, when we have too many cytokines in our body, what happens is known as sickness behaviour, which is one become lethargic, have difficulty sleeping and mood swings, the common symptoms of depression. You see, cytokines actually decrease synthesis of serotonin by turning tryptophan, often a precursor of serotonin, into other molecules, which has been seen in rats when the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis was aggressively stimulated. This is why it's often so hard to break the cycle when one patient becomes depressed. There has been links to cytokine concentration in depressed patients, and even activity within the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis. But as this theory is newer, we don't really have any medication to treat it. We're honestly kind of stuck. Hopefully research will explore this idea more. So here are our theories, and honestly they're all pretty good. Obviously genetics has every right to believe to play a role in developing the disorder, but it definitely seems like our hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis could be another underlying mechanism. Or just maybe, depression is a result of the 4 humours being imbalanced, which we kind of dismissed hundreds of years ago, or even a demon. Perhaps these theories are even working together, and it's why it's so difficult to treat. All we can do is hope that in our lifetimes we can find a solution, ending depression's reign of terror for good. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It's free and it really helps me out. See you next time.